Welcome back to your sanctuary after sundown, the subconscious classroom, where the quiet corners of history unfold slowly and strangely, like smoke through an open window. Tonight's story drifts into the oldest kind of silence, the kind born when a village gathers to choose who must not see tomorrow, before courtrooms, before science, before even the idea of fairness. There were rituals, Strauss, marked stones, spun bottles, a name whispered in the dark, not because they were guilty, but because someone had to go. In this long, immersive journey, we'll walk through the plague-struck alleys of medieval Europe, trace the outlines of ancient altars, and peer into modern echoes of sacrifice, where entire communities pinned their survival to the fate of one. You'll learn how we made peace with chaos by choosing a scapegoat, and how often, even now, that choice still happens in subtler forms. So let your breath slow, let your mind wander toward the torchlit gatherings, the whispered blame, the impossible decisions etched into time. And if you find yourself staring into the circle, ask, quietly, what would I have done? Let us begin. Part 1: Rituals of the Random Sacrifice. In the hush before dawn, when birds pause and dew lies thick on thatched rooftops, entire villages once gathered in trembling anticipation. Today someone must die so the rest can live. This was not myth, it was chilling history. From ancient Israel to plague-ravaged Europe, from remote Greek islands to pre-colonial Africa, communities practiced lotteries of death, drawing lots or bargaining with the divine to choose one soul whose fate would protect the many. It was hard, it was brutal, and yet it happened. The origin of this ritual is as old as collective survival. Picture a community facing pestilence, drought, famine, or invasion. Options were few. Prayer, yes, but sometimes prayers demanded payment. A human life offered not from malice, but necessity. One life offered to avert disaster. The sacrifice could be voluntary, coerced, or most hauntingly, random. Randomness played a moral role. By casting lots, villages embraced fate rather than personal blame. When death arrives by chance, there is no murderer. Yet the act remains shocking. In the Hebrew scriptures, the lot casting of Saul before the plunder of the Amalekites, or the selection of Jonah to be tossed from ship to sea, both show an ancient belief. Deciding by lot leans on divine will rather than human judgment. But biblical ritual was only a beginning. Fast forward to mid-medieval Europe. Recurring epidemics, crop failures, and social upheaval forced desperate responses. Pestilence gripped towns. Surgeons and clergy were powerless. Priests led processions. Bells tolled, yet the sickness spread. Villagers, breaking down, turned to archaic rituals. They convened in stone squares and huddled inside church walls. Names were written on scraps of parchment, placed into urns, and drawn by trembling overseers. Whatever name appeared, that person was declared the scapegoat. They might be banished, beaten, or worst of all, sacrificed at the edge of town, body left to plague spirits, wild beasts, or the elements. In some cases, they were buried alive in fields, the soil itself used to absorb contagion. Small Greek island communities during the Ottoman period faced shipborne cholera. When clergy and elders felt powerless, they resumed ancient customs, drawing lots at the church door, sending the chosen villager to the cemetery at dusk with a candle. That villager was told to die alone. No rescue, no care. Sometimes the lot fell to someone already ill. Other times to someone merely unlucky. In one haunting case from 1835, a village in Crete drew the name of a young mother. She carried her baby onto the rooftop at sunset and remained until the wind and cold claimed her. There were no formal records, only folk tales passed through whispers. Her sacrifice supposedly halted the epidemic. Whether reliable or not, the tale captured a terrifying truth. Desperate times breed darkest rituals. On a colder continent, Central Europe endured something similar during witch hunts and famines. When superstition took hold, disasters were too easily blamed on witches or demons. Entire villages held scapegoat ceremonies. White-robed participants drew names. Whoever lost everything: land, family, life. These ceremonies were both ritual and public spectacle. The condemned would be tied to a stake, whipped, or drowned in wooded lakes. In some smaller regions, survivors claimed the village fortune improved afterward, but what was gained against 2 lives lost? Hard to measure. And yet the practice persisted into the 19th century, especially in rural corners with weak central authority. Travel further east to sub-Saharan Africa, where small chiefdoms facing drought performed sacrificial lot rituals. Men and women of childbearing age were separated into groups. Only one would be drawn. He or she was sent into the bush with minimal supplies. Somewhere beyond, they were either never heard from again or returned broken by hunger and fear. These rites were woven into ancestral tradition, appeasing spirits of land and sky who sometimes demanded a blood price. The sacrifice was not punishment, but blessing, an act of offering, regretted but believed essential. Wherever villagers turned to lots, they spoke of divine agency. If God or spirits chose, who were they to argue? Loss became tolerable. The heartache remained, but guilt was shared with stone, wind, and fate. One turning point came in 16th century France. The plague returned in waves across Provence, Lyon, Rouen. One summer, a town in northern Burgundy followed tradition. Lottery for death. A young woodcutter was selected, but priests argued the ritual was pagan and illegitimate. They invoked royal edicts then being drawn across France, outlawing cruel superstitions. When the lots fell, they were dismissed and medical care was offered instead. The woodcutter survived. The disease surged elsewhere, but for that village, reason held sway over ritual. That moment marked a shift. Authority claimed control. Rituals of choice no longer belonged only to tradition. Still, the shadow remained longer in remote hills. In parts of Switzerland's Appenzell region, stories survived into the 1800s of a plague maiden sacrificed by lottery. She was reported to meander out of town each spring, wearing white, and walk into the mountains, sometimes never heard of again, sometimes returning delirious. Cemetery records were silent. Oral histories hauntingly echoed the need for exchange. Her disappearance meant fields would revive. Common people reported guilt for generations. The sacrifice, they said, saved them, but at what cost to conscience? What did it take to live on after you had chosen someone to die? As early modern legal systems expanded, organized religion and state authority began to challenge these communal decisions. In colonial New England, Puritan leaders outlawed popular lotteries for death. They punished participants with fines or imprisonment. Their argument: life was sacred, not subject to popular whim. But laws only mattered where they reached. In isolated backwoods settlements, rumors circulated of plague hands, scapegoated individuals left under cliff overhangs. In Europe, Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau denounced sacrifice lotteries in essays and pamphlets. Rousseau wrote, "A society that tampers with souls over disease trades reason for superstition and loses both. But reasoning won slowly. Superstition had roots deeper than rational thought, roots in fear, communal identity, and belief in cosmic order." In the early 20th century, During wartime sieges in Russia and the Balkans, desperate villagers briefly revived old lottery rights to appease hunger or disease. They themselves often blew these accounts away as backward superstition. Still, the very memory lingered. When survival is stripped bare, history's darkest rituals can rise again. Tonight, as you follow the story of villages that chose one to die, recognize the tension between communal survival and moral cost. Understand that the lottery was not random cruelty, but a communal contract with fate, an algorithm of despair. Human lives were never cheap, but they could be spent in darker currencies. Solidarity, superstition, desperation. In the next part, we trace how communities debated the human price of these rituals, how some volunteers stepped forward, others resisted, how priests and magistrates contended with communal pulse, and how the modern state began to rewrite the rules of sacrifice. Part 2: Sacrifice by Lottery and Superstition. As the centuries rolled forward, the village did not disappear. It simply changed its shape. In towns, in cities, even in empires, the instinct to purge, to cleanse, to select one for the good of the many, continued to thrive. And perhaps nowhere was this clearer than in the rituals that looked like randomness but masked deep cultural anxieties. The lottery was no game, it was a tool for blood. One of the most famous fictional echoes of this truth comes from Shirley Jackson's 1948 short story, The Lottery, where a small, seemingly peaceful American town gathers each year to draw slips of paper from a black box. The person who draws the marked slip is stoned to death by the others. No reason.
No explanation.
Just tradition. What made the story terrifying wasn't just the act. It was the casualness. The way horror slipped unnoticed into normality. But Jackson wasn't writing fantasy. She was reflecting a history that had already happened, again and again. In some rural parts of Europe, harvest rituals retained strange, violent undertones well into the modern period. Villagers would symbolically kill a corn spirit or straw man to ensure a good crop. In some places, these figures were purely effigies, bundles of hay or carved wooden dolls. But in others, tales speak of choosing a real person to stand in for the spirit, with beatings or ritualistic abuse inflicted before the harvest. Even when death was not the goal, pain served as sacrifice. Among the Norse, blot sacrifices were both animal and, on rare occasions, human. Chieftains would sometimes offer up a slave or prisoner to the gods, especially during times of famine or after military defeat. The belief was transactional, blood for favor. A life, especially one considered lesser, might buy the success of a voyage or the return of the sun. Communities that depended on agriculture and seafaring often viewed a single death as an investment in the survival of many. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this logic was how arbitrary it could become. In some regions of India, the goddess Kali was believed to accept blood offerings. While animal sacrifice was common, whispered stories persisted of human offerings in secret, especially of low-caste individuals or those considered social outcasts. The cultural hierarchy provided justification. The expendable, the invisible, the ones already halfway out of society. Across the Americas, the Aztec Empire institutionalized human sacrifice on a scale unmatched in the pre-modern world. Victims were often captured warriors, but not always. During times of famine, some city-states selected their own citizens. The Feast of the Flaying honored the god Totec with the sacrifice of individuals who were then flayed. Sometimes their skins were worn ceremonially by priests or others for days afterward. These acts weren't considered cruelty. They were believed to hold cosmic importance. To fail to feed the gods was to risk the destruction of the world. What makes many of these sacrifices so chilling is not the violence, but the context. They were normalized, celebrated even. The person chosen might be treated like royalty for days before their death. They were paraded, bathed, fed, even given lovers. But always the ending was the same. One goes, I'll stay. And it wasn't always about gods. Often it was about fear. In 18th century France, there are records of isolated villages responding to outbreaks of ergot poisoning, a fungal infection from rye bread that causes hallucinations and convulsions, by blaming a single resident. The symptoms were strange enough to mimic witchcraft, and if a person had enemies or seemed odd, it wasn't hard for fingers to point. Trials were not always legal proceedings. Sometimes they were whispers that became fires. Witch hunting itself is one of history's most prolonged examples of ritual scapegoating. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were executed across Europe and the colonies, often during times of famine, disease, or economic crisis. The accused were rarely wealthy. Often they were old, childless, poor, or otherwise outside the bounds of community power. A misbehaving cow, a sudden storm, a child's fever. Any unexplained misfortune could become a noose. The power of a scapegoat is that it offers a solution. Not a real one, but a satisfying one. Something to explain the chaos. Something to punish. When a village believes it can erase bad luck by erasing a body, even decent people can find themselves applauding a death. In Japan, during the Edo period, there was a practice known as uchikawashi, or smashing. When landlords raised taxes or food was scarce, angry villagers would gather to destroy property, warehouses, and sometimes homes. But often, rather than revolt outright, they'd select a single scapegoat, usually a minor official, merchant, or other intermediary, and target them. Violence with limits, a lesson taught through one broken life. Even in ancient Rome, when the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses sworn to chastity, were suspected of breaking their vows, the punishment was death by burial. But only one would be selected at a time, even if multiple were rumored. The symbolism mattered more than the truth. The city's purity had to be restored. Someone had to go under. And yet, in every instance, these deaths left shadows. In the village's memory, in local songs and stories, in unearthed graves with no names. Because while the ritual might have been meant to purge, it often created new wounds. A village that chooses to kill its own carries a burden, even if it calls the killing justice. The randomness, the formality, the sheer performative spectacle of these sacrifices reveals something deeper. A collective belief that the group is more important than the individual, and that fate must be helped along. This belief is as old as firelight, and perhaps as dangerous. As we move forward, we'll explore the darker ends of this impulse, where nations, not just villages, adopted the logic of scapegoating, where superstition became policy, and where bureaucracies replaced priests, but the result stayed the same. Someone always had to go. Part 3: When empires needed a sacrifice. If a village could choose one to die, what happened when the village grew into a nation? The urge did not disappear, it evolved. The mechanisms became more elaborate, the language more polite, the reasons cloaked in legality or necessity. But the result was often the same: sacrifice dressed in state regalia. In the early days of Christianity, martyrdom was not just endured, it was embraced. Roman emperors like Decius and Diocletian unleashed waves of persecution meant to restore imperial unity through religious purification. Christians became scapegoats for everything from natural disasters to military defeats. Burnings, beheadings, crucifixions, They were all ways to satisfy a political need. Someone had to take the blame for Rome's decline. Even as the empire crumbled, the logic held. Fast forward to the height of the Black Death in the 14th century. Across Europe, panic filled the air as 1/3 of the population perished. Unable to explain the invisible plague, many turned to the oldest comfort they knew, finding someone to blame. Jews were accused of poisoning wells and conspiring with demonic forces. In cities like Strasbourg and Basel, entire communities were rounded up, burned alive, or expelled. These were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were rituals of social cleansing, sacrifice on an industrial scale, carried out by terrified towns seeking salvation through blood. The pogroms that followed were often bureaucratically endorsed, complete with edicts and records. Here, the ancient instinct had acquired a seal and signature. The village torch had been replaced by parchment and wax. In revolutionary France, the guillotine became an altar of modern purification. The reign of terror turned the state itself into a priesthood of executioners. Revolutionary tribunals moved swiftly. A misplaced word, a known associate, a slow clap at the wrong speech, any of it could be cause for arrest. The idea wasn't just to punish the guilty, it was to purge impure elements for the health of the republic. Even those who had helped build the revolution were not safe. Robespierre, architect of the guillotine's rise, eventually lost his head to it. The village logic, sacrifice to cleanse, had simply moved into the halls of government. In 17th century England, public hangings served as both punishment and performance. Crowds gathered for hours, eating and drinking while watching those condemned for crimes ranging from petty theft to treason. The gallows was the community's release valve, an expression of moral panic and collective reassurance. Even as the Enlightenment blossomed, the village never truly disappeared. Elsewhere, in imperial China, emperors held the mandate of heaven, a divine right to rule. But when famines or earthquakes struck, the people sometimes believed the mandate had been revoked. Officials, often innocent of direct wrongdoing, were executed to restore cosmic balance. The logic was ancient. Remove the corrupted limb to save the body. These acts weren't just political, they were ritualistic, designed to align the heavens once more. And yet, not all modern sacrifices looked like executions. Some were quieter, administrative. In Nazi Germany, entire categories of people were labeled life unworthy of life. The disabled, the mentally ill, the socially deviant, selected not for what they'd done, but for what they represented. Institutions like Hadamar and Grafeneck euthanized thousands under the T4 program. It was called mercy. It was paperwork, signatures, and gas chambers. A village of millions now had a system and a logic to remove its chosen. Even democratic nations found themselves seduced by the old rituals. During World War II, Japanese Americans were rounded up and placed in internment camps, not for anything they had done, but because of what they symbolized. Fear needed an outlet. Sacrifice once again seemed easier than trust. It didn't matter if the person had lived in California for 30 years or fought in World War I. In the end, someone had to be chosen. These modern scapegoats often weren't killed, but they were erased. Erased from towns, from records, from memory. And in some ways, that erasure was worse. Turned the ritual invisible. It allowed the village to say it had moved on, when in truth, it had simply changed costumes. The Cold War brought a new kind of paranoia. Loyalty oaths, blacklists, and accusations of communist sympathy ran rampant. Careers were destroyed, lives upended, and all without trials, without proof. The village had become the nation, the mob had become the state, but the need remained. Someone must fall to keep the rest standing. Why do we do this? Why does the village, even when scaled to millions, still need to choose one to die or vanish? Because fear is contagious. Because chaos demands a shape. Because it's easier to believe in a wicked neighbor than in a meaningless storm. The scapegoat offers order in the face of entropy. It gives people something to point to and say, that's why things are bad. That's what we must remove. And often it works, for a while. But always, eventually, the sacrifice begins to rot at the center of the village. The guilt seeps in. The history gets rewritten. The effigy, once burned in celebration, becomes a ghost. Still, the ritual survives. In whispers, in systems, in policy. The names change. The costumes evolve. But the heartbeat remains the same. Next, we'll descend into the rituals themselves, the ways communities prepared the chosen, the songs they sang, the stones they cast. Because choosing someone to die wasn't only about violence, it was about ceremony. The drama of sacrifice needed an audience. And the village always watched. Part 4. Rituals for choosing the unchosen. It's one thing to decide that someone must go. It's another thing entirely to decide who. And for most of history, the act of choosing, the lottery, the drawing, the omen mattered almost as much as the act of killing. Rituals didn't just make the sacrifice palatable. They made it sacred. In ancient Athens, ostracism was democratic exile. Once a year, citizens were invited to write the name of someone they thought dangerous to the city-state on a piece of pottery, an ostracan. If enough people agreed, that person would be banished for 10 years. There was no trial. No crime had to be proven. It wasn't punishment. It was purification. The individual, whether guilty or not, became a symbol of imbalance. And by removing them, balance was restored. The act was deeply performative, a kind of political bloodletting done with ink instead of blades. Biblical traditions offered a more direct ritual. The original scapegoat described in Leviticus was literally a goat. 2 were chosen, one sacrificed to God, the other symbolically burdened with the sins of the community and driven into the wilderness. It wasn't about guilt, it was about expulsion. Removing the goat removed the stain. This story etched itself into the cultural logic of sacrifice, and echoes of it ripple forward through time, changing languages, changing shapes, but never disappearing. In parts of medieval Europe, communities faced with famine, disease, or drought sometimes turned to human lotteries. A child might be selected by drawing lots. An elderly man might be offered by a village consensus. Sometimes the volunteer was silent. Sometimes they protested. But always the act had a justification. We must give one to save the many. One of the more chilling examples came from Eberhausen in 1510, when a town struck by plague decided to sacrifice a member of the poorest family, claiming the disease needed a vessel to carry it away. The man was executed in the village square. Records from nearby towns noted that Eberhausen did indeed avoid the worst of the epidemic that year, and the ritual was remembered not as murder, but as deliverance. In Japan, certain Shinto rites once called for Hitobashira, human pillars. Builders would sometimes bury a person alive beneath a bridge or castle to placate the spirits and ensure structural integrity. It sounds grotesque now, but for them it was a sacred pact, your body for the safety of many. Echoes of this belief persisted even into the 16th century. Some whispered that without a human offering, buildings would fall or rivers would rise. Elsewhere, in West African traditions, when a king died, his servants or family members were sometimes ritually slain to accompany him into the afterlife. It wasn't revenge, it was duty. They were chosen not because they failed, but because they mattered. That's how warped and woven the logic of sacrifice could become. Death wasn't always punishment. Sometimes it was honor. And in Aztec Mexico, the entire calendar revolved around rituals of offering. Each month had its own god, its own festival, its own victims. Hearts were cut from chests on high platforms, blood flowed down the temple stairs, and the people watched, not in horror but in awe. To them, these deaths kept the sun moving. Without sacrifice, there would be no world. Even during times when religion faded, ritual persisted. During the 17th century, witch trials in Europe and New England, elaborate systems were constructed to prove guilt. Floating in water, counting moles, stumbling recitations of the Lord's Prayer. These weren't designed to uncover truth. They were mechanisms for ritual certainty. The community needed someone to burn, and it needed to feel justified. The trial was the modern village's sacrificial drumbeat. In some parts of colonial India under British rule, famine relief decisions were made with algorithms. How much aid could be spared without upsetting the budget? Officials knew people would die, but the math made it sanitary. Numbers were drawn, priorities made. No one stood in the square with a dagger, but the result was the same. Someone was chosen quietly to go. What makes these rituals so haunting is that they're not about cruelty. They're about cohesion. The sacrifice, however terrible, binds the group. The act of choosing, of marking one person as other, reinforces the collective identity of those who remain. We are not them. We are the choosers. We are the clean. Even today, this logic lingers. In schools, one child becomes the bullied. In corporations, one person is blamed for systemic failure. In politics, one scandal wipes away many sins. The group survives by offering up an individual. The ancient lottery still turns, only now it wears a tie and speaks legalese. What separates a ritual from a crime? Is it the number of people watching? The presence of a priest or politician? Or is it the belief, the quiet agreement that this, horrible as it is, must happen? The villages of the past believed their survival required ceremony, that the act of choosing someone to die had to be done with care, with theater, with meaning. Not because they were barbarians, but because they were human, and humans fear chaos more than cruelty. Next, we'll drift into the aftermath, the silence that follows a chosen death, because the story doesn't end when the blood is spilled. Sometimes that's when it begins. Part 5. The silence after the chosen fell. Once the chosen one was gone, whether driven out, buried beneath stone, or sacrificed on a dais, the village did not erupt into joy. There were no parades. There was only silence, the hush that follows any irreversible act. And in that stillness, something else settled. The question of what now? Communities that had participated in sacrifice, especially those where the act was collective and symbolic, often experienced what could be described as ritual recoil. The purge, intended to restore order, could leave behind an ache, a psychic bruise. The Aztecs washed their hands and hearts after ceremonial offerings. The Greeks poured libations. The ancient Hebrews released scapegoats into the wild, hoping the sins carried away would never wander back. But guilt, real or imagined, lingers, and so did remembrance. In 17th century France, a rural village executed a young woman accused of spreading plague by witchcraft. Her name was forgotten, but the rock where she was stoned was left undisturbed for generations. Children were told not to touch it, not because it was sacred, but because it was dangerous. The community had done what it thought was necessary, but it feared the memory might still bite. In other places, rituals were established not to glorify the sacrifice, but to contain it. In parts of rural Japan, after Hitobashira, the live burial of a human pillar, villagers would place bamboo markers or small shrines above the site. Offerings were made to the buried not as victims, but as protectors. A grim kind of veneration emerged. The person chosen to die became both warning and guardian. In Plague-era Italy, entire towns that had sealed their gates and refused the sick erected monuments afterward. Not for the infected, but for those who stayed behind, locked inside as neighbors perished. The choice to sacrifice community contact, to become a kind of collective scapegoat in quarantine, left scars no stone could truly cover. Even in cases where the victim survived, the mark of being chosen left a lifelong brand. In some Eastern European villages during times of famine or siege, lots were drawn not for death, but for exile. One person, often a beggar, a widow, or a stranger, was turned out, accused of attracting misfortune. If they lived as ghost figures, wandering between hamlets, rarely welcome, forever suspected of having deserved it. The stories of those chosen rarely survive in their own words. They were silenced, erased, or mythologized. What we have instead are village records, legal notes, church inscriptions, traces of justification. Lines that explain the act but never its echo. But not all echoes were haunted. In some cases, the aftermath brought resilience. Following the 1349 Strasbourg massacre, when Jews were falsely blamed for the Black Death and hundreds were burned alive, survivors and descendants rebuilt, resisted, remembered. In the ashes of scapegoating, a kind of collective defiance bloomed. Communities realized that the tools of sacrifice could be turned against them at any moment, and solidarity became survival. In 18th century France, the Enlightenment sparked a reevaluation of blame. Philosophers questioned the morality of public executions and witch trials. Voltaire ridiculed the very idea of scapegoats with his biting satire. In time, the need for a chosen victim began to feel, at least among the literate elite, less divine and more absurd. But this rejection didn't mean the impulse vanished. It only changed form. Industrial cities of the 19th century found new scapegoats. The poor, the immigrant, the mentally ill. Cholera outbreaks were blamed on slums, not sewage. Economic panic was blamed on outsiders, not banks. The rituals no longer involved altars, but headlines and laws. Still, someone always had to go. And in the 20th century, totalitarian regimes elevated scapegoating into brutal art. Propaganda painted entire ethnic groups or social classes as the root of national pain. These weren't sacrifices to restore harmony, they were purges to rewrite history. No longer symbolic offerings, just murder. What made the ancient village different was its intimacy. The chosen one was not far away. They were your neighbor, your cousin, the child who played near your door. That closeness gave the ritual both weight and horror. The aftermath meant living with the absence and sometimes with the guilt. Some cultures tried to atone. In parts of West Africa, after ritual sacrifice, the community would gather not just for mourning, but for cleansing. Songs were sung not to the gods, but to the lost. In Polynesian traditions, bones of the sacrificed were kept in sacred places, not trophies, but remembrances. The chosen were not just vessels of fear, they were honored as necessary. Still, the most chilling truth may be this: the village often moved on. Life returned to rhythm. Bread was baked.
Bells rang.
Children laughed. The one who was chosen faded like smoke. And yet, the ritual always remained close. Close enough that, when fear returned, be it in the form of famine, disease, or drought, the wheel could be spun again. Because someone always had to go. Next, we enter the era where science, not spirit, began to explain suffering. Yet scapegoats still appeared. The dress changed, but the ritual stayed the same. Part 6. Enlightenment didn't kill the ritual. For a moment, it seemed the ritual might die. The Enlightenment, with its glow of reason and progress, cast new light on old superstitions. In salons and coffee houses across Europe, thinkers declared the age of sacrifice over. Diseases had causes. Calamities had explanations. Misfortune could be mapped with microscopes and mathematics. And yet, scapegoats still found themselves chosen. Because fear, as it turned out, was not so easily reasoned away. In 1720, when plague crept ashore in Marseille, it arrived not as punishment from the gods, but as infection from a ship. Officials knew this, and still, the port guards who had failed to contain the vessel were blamed and banished. Markets blamed butchers.
Priests blamed sin.
Sailors were lynched. Old patterns stirred beneath new logic. During the French Revolution, rationalism danced hand in hand with ritual sacrifice. The guillotine, marketed as humane, efficient, and egalitarian, became an altar. Robespierre's reign of terror turned trials into performance. The crowd did not shout prayers. They shouted slogans, but it was still blood to buy order. Still someone chosen. Still someone gone. In the new world of revolutions and republics, the chosen changed costumes. The scapegoat became political. In revolutionary America, loyalists were tarred and feathered. In revolutionary Haiti, French planters fled or died. In revolutionary Russia, nobles, kulaks, and intellectuals found themselves labeled as poison in the bloodstream of the people. The language evolved, but the action was familiar. A group is blamed. A victim is selected. The village, now the nation, watches. And yet, some places truly tried to break the pattern. In England, by the early 19th century, courts began to question confessions obtained by torture. Witch trials were not just rare, they were ridiculed. No longer would old women be drowned for causing storms. But that didn't mean the hunger for blame had disappeared. It merely shifted targets. Take the Irish famine. While blight was the biological cause of the potato collapse, British officials blamed the Irish themselves for being superstitious, for breeding too quickly, for clinging to Catholicism. Relief was delayed. Entire communities were abandoned, not sacrificed in ceremony, but sacrificed all the same. The logic of scapegoating had simply adopted economic language. In the cities rising with industrial steam, disease took new forms: cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, and again the finger pointed outward. Immigrants were accused of spreading contagion. The poor were told they invited illness through laziness. Tenements became both homes and accusations. The body politic remained unchanged, a wound blamed on someone else's skin. In America, lynchings became communal events. Victims, often black men, were cast as threats to white virtue, white wealth, white safety. Mob violence was not lawless, it was theatrical. Newspapers advertised the date. Postcards were printed. Crowds gathered, watched, cheered. The justifications were modern: crime, outrage, order, but the logic was ancient. Community cleansed through blood. Meanwhile, in villages untouched by factories and printing presses, older rights clung to life. In rural Romania, when crops failed, Elders might accuse a villager of drawing away the rain. The accused was usually someone strange, someone marginal. The village might perform a ritual banishment, symbolic but with real teeth. Houses were burned, names erased, and the rains eventually returned. On Pacific Islands, when hurricanes or volcanic eruptions struck, some communities revived forgotten ceremonies, offering animals and sometimes people to the ocean or the earth, not because they were ignorant of natural forces, but because ritual provided a frame. Tragedy needed choreography. Even now, even with weather maps and tectonic sensors, some storms feel personal. Someone must have called it down. And in the 20th century, a new altar appeared, the state. Totalitarian regimes mastered the art of collective sacrifice. Stalin's purges didn't just eliminate opposition, they identified enemies within. The kulak, the saboteur, the wreckers.
Millions vanished.
Trials were public, but truth was irrelevant. Guilt was assigned, not proven. It was the village again, scaled up to a nation, and still the same impulse. Blame must wear a face. In Nazi Germany, Jews were not merely accused, they were transformed into the cause of everything. Economic collapse, cultural decay, war itself. Entire communities voted for persecution. Neighbors turned in neighbors. The selection was not random, but the mechanics of sacrifice remained. Fear, focus, removal, all to restore a mythic order. In Maoist China, the Cultural Revolution offered teenagers the chance to cleanse their communities of impure thought. Teachers were humiliated. Parents were denounced. Books were burned. The village was now the school. The ritual was rebranded as revolution. And in America, during the Red Scare, blacklists served as modern-day exile. Artists, actors, professors, people whose ideas fell outside the lines were made examples of. Sacrifice without blood, but not without pain. Even now, in times of panic, we reach for the same tools. After September 11th, Muslims across the Western world became convenient scapegoats. Mosques were vandalized. Neighbors were watched. Governments built surveillance programs based not on action, but on profile. The community needed reassurance, and it came at the cost of the other. During the COVID-19 pandemic, conspiracy swelled again. Some blamed migrants, some blamed specific nations, some blamed vaccines. In the absence of clarity, rituals returned, masked not as religion, but as social media storms, as protests, as blame thinly disguised as concern. And yet, despite this bleak pattern, there are cracks of resistance. In Rwanda, after the 1994 genocide, the community implemented Gacaca courts, not to continue the ritual of choosing, but to offer a new kind of closure. Truth was encouraged. Reconciliation was prioritized. Not everyone forgave. Not every hurt was healed, but the ritual was interrupted. In South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did something even more radical. It invited victims and perpetrators to speak, not to identify new scapegoats, but to name what had been done. It did not always work, but it was a step toward ending the cycle. In modern Iceland, after the banking collapse of 2008, instead of blaming immigrants or outsiders, the public demanded trials for the bankers. The system, not a scapegoat, was scrutinized, a rare moment when a community chose not to turn on itself. These examples are fragile, but they show the ritual is not inevitable. Still, the instinct remains deep. We are wired to seek patterns. When crops fail, when the sky darkens, when death comes too soon or too often, we want a reason. And if none is obvious, we find a face, a name, a body to carry the fear. What distinguishes us from the ancient villagers is not our intellect, but our capacity to resist that impulse. We now know how disease spreads, how economies rise and fall, how climate shifts, but knowledge does not erase fear. It only offers an alternative. And so we must ask again and again, when things go wrong, do we choose to understand, or do we choose someone to blame? The village lives on in all of us, but maybe now we can stop choosing one to die. Maybe now we can choose instead to listen, to learn, to build something beyond the circle of stones and the old familiar fire. Part 7, The Last Circle of Stones. Even in the age of satellites and statistics, the circle persists. We may no longer cast lots with bones or lead a scapegoat into the wilderness, but we still gather, digitally, socially, nationally, and we still point. The methods have changed. The myths have new names, but the ritual remains intact, hidden beneath the language of progress. In rural communities clinging to the margins of modernity, echoes of the old sacrifices still hum beneath the surface. In parts of Southeast Asia, bloodletting rituals for village safety continued quietly into the 21st century, not as official religion, but as private tradition. A chicken, a goat, or sometimes a symbolic human figure might be offered during eclipse,